Hello and welcome to the second and final webinar as part of the NDIS Success Roadmap Governance Series. Today's topic is Strategy, Risk and Impact. My name is Andrew Ellis, and on behalf of the Community Business Bureau Consulting Team, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. First up, Community Business Bureau acknowledges the traditional owners of country throughout Australia. We recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and community. Pay our respects to them and their cultures and to elders past, present and emerging. And at present, I am recording this on the Kaurna lands in Adelaide. The NDIS, or the National Disability Insurance Scheme, is on its way to supporting 460,000 Australians who are living with disability. It's important that all Australians have the confidence in the quality and the safety of supports being provided to people with disability. And to that end, it's important for providers to have an appropriate strategy and appropriate risk management processes in place, as well as to know and be able to measure how they're having an impact. And all those things are our topics for today. The NDIS Quality and Safeguarding Scheme plays an important role, and the Disability Royal Commission is expected to highlight the fact that the sector needs to offer solutions and measures to ensure supports are safe and of high quality. However, boards have to play a proactive role and take responsibility for effective oversight of NDIS service providers. We're running two webinar series at the moment that's just about to conclude. The first one was focused on management and the second one on governance. You can see the titles of each of those webinars on your screen there at the moment. The management series for leaders, managers, operational staff and sole traders looked at the fundamentals of the NDIS to help you understand what it means to provide services under the NDIS. It looked at the importance of understanding the market that you want to operate in as well. Who are your potential customers? What do they need and want from their NDIS provider? And who else is already providing NDIS services in your area? The third webinar looked at the NDIS service model and how to develop that. We have one on the compliance requirements as part of the quality and risk elements to working in the NDIS. The fifth of the webinars in the management series was on strategic and marketing planning. And then the last was on understanding and analysing your potential revenue and associated costs. Financial viability is critical for long-term sustainability in the NDIS, and there's many tools and techniques for how to go about that. If any of those topics interest you, you can still go back and have a read of the notes on the website for CBB, and you can also go back and view the videos that are still available for each of those at the moment. Within the governance series, today is one of two webinars that is focused on governance and helps to provide a roadmap for your NDIS success. In the first webinar, we gave you insights into the fundamentals of the NDIS to help you understand what it means to provide services in the NDIS. And in the second webinar today, we'll speak about strategy, risk and impact working in the NDIS. I think that if you're an organisation that provides services other than disability services, like you might be in aged care or other community services as well, you'll find elements of today's presentation and webinar equally as relevant to other parts of your business as they are to the NDIS. Given our subject of governance today, we'll focus primarily in this webinar on the role and responsibility of the board. Our aim is to build board member understanding of the impacts and opportunities of the NDIS so that you can make more informed strategic decisions and provide effective support to the executive leadership. Each of our webinars will be followed by a Q&A session, and so next week we'll have a Q&A session on this governance second webinar as well. If you've got any questions, we encourage you to submit those anytime in the next week via the Facebook group or via email. I'd also encourage you to join the NDIS Success Facebook group if you haven't had a chance yet, and also to join the CBB LinkedIn group as another way to stay in touch with content like this that we're producing on a regular basis. So today's webinar, let's get into it. Today's session looks at a number of key elements in the effective governance of an NDIS-focused business. As part of this, we'll discuss a number of more generic business tools that you possibly have experience using previously, but we'll talk about those with an NDIS focus. First up, we're going to talk about the board's role in strategy and managing risk. We'll look at how to measure impact, and not just outputs or outcomes, but actual impact, social impact, and that's the goal of what most not-for-profit organisations and those working under the NDIS are aiming for. And finally, we want to consider some relevant governance processes within the NDIS. It's not going to be a full-blown governance training session, but there are some key elements that the NDIS highlights that board members need to be aware of. Throughout this webinar, we want to present some practical applications and key elements of the NDIS that you need to address at a board level as part of the governance responsibilities for the organisation. And through today's session, we aim to build board members' understanding of the importance of balancing the social impact of the organisation with a market orientation and monitoring risks in a changing, constantly changing sector. There are both challenges and opportunities in the NDIS market that need to be managed, and these have implications for your strategy, your risk management, and your impact measurement. So first up, we're going to talk about strategy. And the board and management each have a role to play in working on strategy. Ultimately, the board is responsible for the strategic plan and the strategic direction of the organisation, but that doesn't mean the board needs to do all the work on the strategic plan. The starting point of the strategy is through the vision and the mission and the values, and that's where we'll get going from. So the vision and mission. Many not-for-profits and disability providers have got a rich history of being around for 10 or 20 or 50 or even more years, providing important supports and services to vulnerable people. Over that kind of a history of the organisation, things change. Delivery models change, funding models certainly have changed, customer profiles have changed, and membership models sometimes change as well. It's critical that organisations stay true to their core purpose. Funding models like grants, commercial models, and the NDIS can change, but great organisations know how to stay true to their core, true to their purpose, and they don't just chase funding where it's available. Purpose and strategy come before your funding model. Organisations that purely chase after whatever funding is available can sometimes find that they have mission drift and they lose sight of the people that they were set up to serve originally. If you haven't looked at your constitution recently, then I'd start by having a look at the objects that are embedded within that and look at how relevant they are now. Even more than that, if your constitution hasn't been updated for a few years, then it would be worth reviewing and updating and getting some legal advice on things like the requirements around tax status, because that can often change. The mission statement of an organisation defines the company's business, defines its objectives and its approach to how do you reach those objectives. The vision statement describes the desired future position of the company. The vision of a not-for-profit should be about the organisation's beneficiaries and what the organisation is trying to achieve in their long-term picture of the future. Elements of your mission and vision are often combined to provide a statement of the company's purposes and goals. Values, such an important topic. It has been said many times that the fish rots from the head, and whilst that may be a negative way to think about it, it is so important that the board lead by values and set the tone for ethical conduct and the right behaviours in living out the values of the organisation. It's not just enough for an organisation to have the values hung up on the wall or on the website. Your organisation needs to actually live those values out. And this is especially the case through governance and the leadership that's provided by the board. The values should be discussed in the boardroom and be the basis of how and what decisions get made. We've seen the emphasis on organisational culture, which relates to values, coming through company director discussions in the past few years since the Banking Royal Commission. It's also for the board and executive management to communicate what are acceptable and unacceptable behaviours in the organisation. The terrible instances of neglect and abuse within the disability sector that we've seen recently also point to the importance of the board leading the example in having and living the right values throughout an organisation. One really famous example when it comes to the values of an organisation and using that to make decisions is when the pain medication Tylenol had to be recalled, and there were literally millions of packages of medication that had to be recalled. 7 people died after ingesting Tylenol capsules, which had been laced with cyanide. And Johnson & Johnson recalled 31 million capsules, valued at $100 million. And this was several decades ago, back when $100 million was real money. They recalled $100 million worth of those capsules from every store around the world and destroyed them, even though there was a very small number of people that was affected. And though the culprit was never found, this case became known as the gold standard of how to manage crises and the benchmark of why values matter. The decision they made to recall the product had a significant impact on profitability in the short term, but actually led to greater trust in the brand over time and greater sales within just a few years because of how the organisation responded. They put the values first, the customer first, and their own profits second, and over time that brand was rebuilt in a most positive sense. Both the board and management have a role in overseeing and managing strategy on behalf of the organisation. Or put another way, the strategic plan comes together through the combination of top-down and bottom-up input from the board. Input from the board, bottom-up input from management, and it melds together in the middle. It's really up to each organisation to determine how exactly this works with the level of input from each, and that is likely to vary depending on the size, complexity, and the skill sets that you have both at management and at board level. The board represent members, stakeholders, shareholders, and they're in a place to govern the organisation, aligning the purpose, vision, values and strategic priorities to the interests of those members, stakeholders and shareholders. So in developing the strategic plan, the board's role includes leading the strategic planning process. It also includes providing that top-down direction to management in terms of the priorities and focus. And it's about ensuring the organisation stays true to its purpose or its vision and its mission. And the most important thing is that the board needs to set the tone for the culture through living out the values. Management's role includes developing the strategic plan in conjunction with the board, implementing that strategic plan, providing regular reports to the board on performance against the strategy, and importantly as well, management need to put the values into action and develop a culture amongst the staff and volunteers of living out those values. After the strategic plan is developed, the board plays a role in reviewing and approving the budget. They receive and review management reports on progress against strategy, and they monitor changing market dynamics in the environment, which may result in the need to adjust the strategy. This slide, as we've talked through it shows a model for the strategic planning process. It's a model that I've used before myself in organisations, whether I was CEO or a board member, and it's also a model that we've helped organisations with from CBB as well. So the first step in your strategic planning process is to develop a multi-year strategic plan. And often that's written over something like a 3-year period, though there's no real standard set in stone as to what the right amount of time is. Next up is to develop a 1-year business plan or an annual plan, and that is, as the name suggests, over a 1-year period and matched to the organisation's financial year. The business plan is written in conjunction with and matches to the budget. Each of these documents are developed by the board and management together, and often it can be an iterative process, and there may well be a workshop of board and CEO or management as part of developing particularly the strategic plan. Ultimately, the strategic plan, business plan and budget will be recommended by the CEO and approved by the board. Once these key documents are in place, the CEO can work with other staff or managers to develop operational plans. These would be more detailed documents over a 1-year period, matched to that financial year, flowing from the business plan and the strategic plan. These are prepared by the direct report of the CEO and approved by the CEO, and progress against these plans would be reported to the CEO, but not necessarily to the board, given it's in that next level of detail. Within a model like this, many organisations need a document that can be used to communicate with stakeholders, such as the members and is available on your website. You could summarize your multi-year strategic plan down to something like a plan on a page, or even like a glossier version, a graphic design version that can be used for those sorts of purposes, while keeping more of the detail confidential to the board and to management. When implementing a process like this, it's important to link the organisation's annual calendar of key events. For example, for a July to June financial year, you'd want to work on the business plan and budget about May, so that's approved just before the new financial year starts, and hence your strategic plan has to be put together back in about February. So what goes in a strategic plan? At CBB, we believe the most important part of writing the strategic plan is to begin by understanding the market. That's why that was the sole focus of our second webinar in the management series, and you may wish to watch that to learn a bit more about it. The market assessment should make up a significant part of the strategic plan. It includes an analysis of customers, of who they are, what they need and want, who future customers are, and their needs too. It's important to know the market size and trends, since that will help you to translate into what is realistic to achieve your strategy. Analysing your competitors can help you to look for where there's opportunities or mitigating actions that need to be addressed. There are strategic planning tools like models like SOAR and Pestel that you can use to analyse your market environment, and I think they're really useful. SOAR stands for Strengths, Opportunities, Aspirations and Results. It's a bit like doing a SWOT analysis, and actually I've written an article in Forward a couple of months ago, and you'd be able to find that on our website where the other articles are to be able to learn more about that. Pestel, or some others refer to this as like a context canvas, looks at trends and issues from the political, economic, social, technological, environment and legal. It provides a framework to think about both the requirements and the issues that are changing in the market that you're operating in. And again, on this subject, there's an article you'll find on the CBB website that talks in a bit more detail about how to do that kind of analysis. Once you get to setting goals or objectives for what you want to achieve in the years ahead, it's important to make sure that you don't have too many goals and to ensure that you write them in a way that is specific and will enable it to be measured when you are achieving them in the future. As an example, the board might want to see growth, but you need to describe what that means or how much growth you want. You need to be clear on what the strategic expectations are and why, and understand the consequences and risks of scaling too quickly. And that can impact on culture and quality of service, just as examples. We note that the NDIS might just be one part of your strategic plan. Many organisations that provide services in the NDIS also provide services to other parts of the sector. The section of the NDIS plan, section of your strategic plan looking at, this section of this webinar can be applied to your whole organisation and not just to the NDIS part of your planning. Let's have a little bit of a think about an example. And so on screen, you can see an example for a local occupational therapist provider who's working with children or young people with disability. And you can see on screen the strengths, perhaps, of this organisation. They're saying they've got 10 years practice working with children and young people, an established brand name and reputation, a good referral pathway from a local area coordinator that they know, and it's strong administration systems to ensure efficient invoicing and payments received. As they look into their market, they might find opportunities to identify local support coordinators who could be a potential additional source of new referrals. They might find that they want to hire a graduate therapist out of university to help grow their team and see that as an opportunity. And they might want to provide some awareness training to the local school so that teachers are better equipped to work with children with disability. It's another opportunity that they could pursue within their business. Their aspirations might be to see children and young people with disability participating actively in the local community. They want to operate at best practice and keep pushing to improve their professional practices and to be known as the best known occupational therapy team in their local community. Those aspirations are terrific, but it's about also need to understand the results of how we measure the achievement and the attainment of those aspirations. So this organisation has identified having NDIS participants who consistently achieve the targets in their NDIS plans or their goals, and their results being recognised in the industry as leading practice, as well as their business growth through word of mouth referrals. All good results that can indicate whether you're on track to achieve your aspirations. So continuing the same example of this local occupational therapist, we've got a PESTEL analysis here. And in my experience of doing these, many or most organisations, as you go through it, might find 2 out of the 6 that are really highly relevant, 2 out of the 6 that are maybe a lot less relevant, and then 2 out of the 6 headings here, perhaps of a moderate importance to the organisation. And that can change over time, and it can be different from one organisation to another. So for example, with this OT provider that we're talking about, politically they see that there's bipartisan support of the NDIS, and they also see that the Disability Royal Commission is likely to lead to further changes within the sector that could impact quality and safeguarding measures that they're required to follow. Environment, there's minimal requirements and impacts on the nature of those and the nature of environmental requirements on the type of services that the OT provides. So that's perhaps in their instance one of those lesser relevant areas. Social media provides them an opportunity to reach potential new clients with really good targeting. And demographic trends mean a greater number of older potential clients, whereas this organisation had started out supporting more younger clients and children. Technological, well, using a tablet computer and cloud-based software would enable a more efficient service provision for them, meaning that they could type up their notes when they're in a client's home meeting with them, rather than writing it by hand and typing it when they get back to the office, as some organisations do. Economic conditions, well, the economic conditions and job losses may result in less fee-for-service clients if this OT provider is working with across different revenue sources, NDIS, maybe private fee-for-service, and maybe other grants that they could access as well. And then lastly, legal. So working within the NDIS, they'd need to ensure the service agreement template that they use addresses the risks and the requirements of working within that sector. And so there you can see an example of using these tools in a relatively small business of OT provider who's maybe got a couple of staff. And I think in the real power of tools like this is in the thought process, and is in how it can change how you think about your market and what's important to be dealing with at any point in time. Just having a half hour or a short amount of time to sit down and to think about these issues, I think even if you're a sole trader or a small business, it's always going to be time well spent just to have a think through your own business and context using these couple of tools. Doesn't have to be a full-blown strategy day, facilitated, workshops and things like that. Even as a sole trader, using a couple of these simple tools will give you some really important insights into how to run your organisation in a more robust, sustainable, resilient kind of a manner. So I want to turn our mind now to talk more about strategy within the NDIS environment. And increasingly, there's an importance of involving your customers in the process of setting strategy. It's good business practice, and it's increasingly becoming a requirement under different quality standards to involve customers in that process of designing your strategy. There's ways you can do that, including surveys, discussion and focus groups, separately organised or constituted groups like a consumer advisory committee, which some organisations, large and not-for-profits, might have. Whatever your organisation's approach, involving customers helps to ensure the services align to what they need. For many organisations, the NDIS and disability services are just one part of that strategic plan. There might be other services, including aged care, and so you need to think about how the NDIS fits within the overall objectives of the organisation. We've seen 5 revisions to the price guide this year. In fact, I think since this presentation was put together, I think it's up to 6. And now we have a Disability Royal Commission that's at work as well. The NDIS market is continually changing, and is really important to stay on top of the changes to ensure you keep up with price changes and modify your business model to adapt to changes. The NDIA release data on a quarterly basis. In fact, I saw some out just yesterday, showing how the NDIS market is evolving, and it's useful to spend time looking at that data. There's one medium-sized disability organisation I know who was running their services based on an old business model and hadn't changed for a number of years. And they found when they modernised their practices to fit the current model, their income, bottom line income, went up by about $1 million. It's so important to stay on top of the market changes through being on the NDIA mailing list, attending conferences and events run by peak bodies, and even staying on the mailing lists of those peak bodies as well. And I'd encourage you to seek out organisations like CVB or others that you can follow on LinkedIn and be able to provide, be able to use the information that we often provide, and organisations like us to help you stay on top of those changing requirements too. It's important that boards and management committees regularly review and monitor progress against the strategic plan, and specifically the strategic goals and objectives within it. The frequency of reviewing strategy will vary depending on the size and complexity of your organisation and the pace of internal and external change. I think best practice organisations make strategy a part of the business as usual through regular monitoring, alerting decision makers to the need to course correct in a timely way so that goals and objectives are met. Reporting effectively against the strategy starts with getting the strategic goals or objectives worded right at the start of the process. Management are often closer to the changing dynamics in the industry and market environment, so also need to report on those changing market conditions to the board. Strategy monitoring should include at least the following: utilising a template for strategy that's often a table that might list out your goals and objectives, comments against the status, and an indicator like a traffic light against each of them, and also including a report on changing market dynamics. If you make a report on market conditions a regular part of your board reporting template, it can help to keep the board and management team coming back to the important strategic matters rather than getting drawn deeper into operational issues, as can sometimes be the case. The next subject is risk management, and it's an area of real interest and passion for me working in this space at the moment. So this section is going to give a very basic understanding of risk management process and the role of the board in overseeing risk and risks unique to the NDIS business model or environment. I want to start by looking at a definition for risk. So the International Standard on Risk Management defines risk in terms of the effect of uncertainty on achieving objectives. Risk management, therefore, is linked inextricably to your strategy and what you're trying to achieve as an organisation. It's important to differentiate between operational and strategic risk. Operational risk should generally be the responsibility of management to oversee and address. And risk can actually also be seen as a positive thing. So we use the term opportunity to identify positive risk. We suspect there's a risk aversion in some parts of the NDIS market that's resulting in a lot of opportunity being lost. But for not-for-profits, this could also mean that missions remain unfulfilled. Both the board and management have a role in overseeing and managing risk on behalf of the organisation. The board's role is to ensure there's an appropriate risk policy and procedure in place, set the risk appetite for the organisation, lead the culture of risk management, coming back to culture again, and to review and approve significant risks, as well as receive and review management reports on risk management. The role of management includes to implement the risk policy and procedure, drive the culture of risk management through the organisation, develop risk registers, and provide regular reports to the board. This graphic shows the process for risk management, and it comes from the International Standard on Risk Management. The first step in this process is establishing the context of the risk management process. That includes internal as well as external elements. Internal context would be your vision, mission, and values, current strategy, business objectives, your organisational structure, and the different functions and activities of the organisation. And we've touched on many of those elements already in this webinar. The external context includes the market and client base. It includes your competitors, government policy, community stakeholders, and things like that. After setting and establishing that context, the next step is to identify the risks. In my experience, this is usually best done as a brainstorm with a variety of people and perspectives in the room across different parts of the organisation. The risk identified should also include consideration of the source of the risk, what can happen, and the consequence of that risk. For example, you might have a strategic risk associated with a reliance on a key person in the organisation. For small organisations, that might be the senior practitioner in your team. So analysing the risks involves, as the next step, considering the likelihood and consequence of the risks identified so that they can be categorised and ranked. The likelihood relates to the chance or probability of the risk event occurring. The consequences can be thought about from a variety of perspectives. For example, health and safety, or environmental, customer or public perception, employee perception, quality and compliance, and that can include legislative and regulatory compliance, and also the financial or profitability impacts. It's not just about jumping straight to a financial outcome when it comes to these risks. There's many other types of consequences too. Coming back to our risk example of the dependency on a key person. If that one person left, it could have an impact on finances, client satisfaction. You could lose other staff who go with them, and I know an organisation where that happened recently. It would be important to have thought about what you would do if that scenario happened and how to minimise the impact it could have on the business. At the end of this process, you'll have a risk register. Depending on the size and scale of the organisation, you might end up with anything from 20 to 200 risks identified to manage. After assessing the likelihood and consequence of each risk, you can evaluate them into a category of low, medium, high, or extreme. The table here shows the likelihood and consequences of the risks, which can be evaluated into a category of low, medium, high, or extreme. At the bottom left is a rare but catastrophic risk event. So COVID-19 pandemic or an IT cyber attack could fit into that category. At the top right are repeated or frequent lower cost or consequence events. So client cancellations might happen on a regular basis and comparatively cost less each time, although they are still far from ideal and do have an impact on the organisation. To the top left are low consequence and rare events which are probably not even worth worrying about. At the bottom right are repeated and regular catastrophic events. If your risk assessment identifies any of these, then it will be critical to address them ASAP in the most robust manner possible. All your other risks will tend to sit somewhere in the middle, and categorising them as low, moderate, high, and extreme helps to prioritise where you put resources to mitigate those risks. Coming back to our model. After evaluating the risks, it's important to identify treatment strategies to mitigate those risks. What steps are you going to put in place that will reduce the risk? For example, it might be avoiding the risk by deciding not to start or continue with the activity that gives rise to that risk. It might be removing the risk source. It might be doing something that changes the consequence of an event or changes the likelihood. You might share the risk with another party or parties, such as through an insurance. Or you can retain the risk as an informed decision. You might actually determine that you're the best person or you're the best organisation to manage that risk and that it's cost prohibitive to do anything else. It's not always possible to completely get rid of a risk, and thus after applying the risk treatment, you're left with the residual risk. It's important that boards and management committees regularly review and monitor for new and emerging risks. The frequency of reviewing risks and the risk register will vary depending on the complexity of the organisation, the pace of internal and external change, and risk exposure. Whilst lower risk organisations in a stable environment might review risk quarterly, many organisations should look at it more frequently. However, best practiced organisations make risk a part of the business as usual, with regular monitoring of the internal and external elements of the organisation for change, and then alerting decision makers to these changes in a timely way so that appropriate action can be taken. Risk management monitoring should include a number of things. Ensuring that there's a well-constructed risk register in place and reviewed regularly for change. Undertaking broad engagement across the organisation to identify new and emerging risks, ensuring that different perspectives are taken into account and the full range of risks have mitigation plans. I know that's the second time I've said that now in the last couple of slides, but in my experience, every single time I've gone through and done a risk register and we've had someone in a bigger group and different perspectives, there's always something that comes out of it that always strikes me as I never would have thought of that. And that's why it's really important to have that wide range of inputs into that process. Next up, making a report on new and emerging risks a regular part of the board reporting template helps the board and management team consider those risks in a timely manner and keep reviewing them. And monitoring of your relevant internal KPIs to look for emerging internal trends and risks. So for example, staff turnover, safety incidents, those things can give you some data on where you might have some changing risk profile in the organisation. And ensuring that mitigation plans are in place to treat and mitigate the risks as well. These processes should all be documented, and you'll be able to do that through your board agendas or your board papers and your minutes, management team meeting minutes and reports, and auditors may want to assess that as well. So turning our minds to work doing risk and risk management under the NDIS. The NDIS practice standards specify the quality standards to be met by registered NDIS providers to provide supports and services to NDIS participants. There are both core and supplementary modules that apply to different organisations. Amongst the core modules is a section for governance and operational management, and that includes a part on risk management as well. So the outcome of that module that the provider is expected to achieve is that risks to participants and workers and the provider are identified and managed. The text on this page is taken from that NDIS practice standard as it relates to risk management. And these are the indicators to address as part of the risk management activities in your organisation. Registered NDIS providers need to comply with this, including having a documented system to identify and manage risks, which is relevant and proportionate to the size and scale of the provider and complexity of your work. I'd go even further to say as well that unregistered providers ought to have these sorts of processes in place too. The risk management system needs to include addressing the following points: incident management, noting that some incidents are reported to the NDIS, complaints management, work health and safety, human resource management, financial management, information management, so that's IT or cyber risk, and governance. Board members are likely to bring a general appreciation of risk management to their role, but from our experience, there are some specific elements to the NDIS sector that are worth discussing further in a risk context. Health and safety responsibilities and requirements run across all businesses. Within the NDIS, there might be a need for client visits into their homes, visits to client homes. You might be undertaking transportation of clients, lifting clients. All of these require attention within your risk management framework. We expect all directors to have good knowledge and general knowledge of financials, but yet on many boards, they'll rely on one director's clinical experience, if they've even got that. Clinical governance and quality of care risks are critical for the board to be across. And so experience in this area should be part of the board's skills and identified in your board skills matrix. The consequences of getting quality of care wrong can be absolutely devastating. And plus there are additional quality and safeguarding requirements in relation to more intensive supports and risks. So behaviour support, medication management, those sorts of things have additional requirements. And the board really need to understand the services that are being provided and the risks and the regulations attached to them. Also, the board needs to be on top of incidents and complaint statistics and events and have an oversight that they are being followed through and feed into improvement initiatives. We've spoken in previous webinars about the invoicing and payment requirements under the NDIS, but suffice to say that debtors and cash flow are risks that require active management too. Certain types of business may have key person risk, and where there are major dependencies on an individual as part of the work that gets done, that's an important issue for you. Legal and compliance includes accreditation to the NDIS quality and safeguarding, but also managing legal risks, such as the contractual relationships that you have through your service agreements. The board needs to be aware of and ensure insurances are appropriate for the organisation. It might be that you need to have a person responsible for quality and accreditation as well. A number of compliance requirements from the NDIS quality and safeguarding standards also apply to the board. And this can include complying with the NDIS Code of Conduct and screening, such as police checks. Many businesses operating under the NDIS have also found that some of their existing pre-NDIS clients are age 65 plus and were transitioned into the Commonwealth Home Support Program, or CHSP, instead of the NDIS, meaning that they need to comply with CHSP quality safeguarding requirements as well as the NDIS. This environment continues to change, and the board should keep an eye on the progress of the Disability Royal Commission for your own learning and improvement, and also to learn what questions to ask. Deloitte produced the Risk Intelligent Enterprise Maturity Model about a decade ago, and I think it provides a great perspective to look at your risk management activities, no matter the size or focus of your organisation. Level 1 is tribal and heroic, and that's about ad hoc risk management, which might be done well by one person or group within the organisation. Level 2 specialist silos is where there are some risk mitigations in place and steps taken to reduce risk. You might have insurance in place and a few simple policies, but risk is only thought about by a few people. Level 3 top down is where the tone of risk management is set at the top, and policies and procedures are in place, but risk management is still somewhat reactive. Many disability and aged care organisations, I would say, are at this point now. The quality and safeguarding standards that we operate under have ensured that most organisations get to this point. However, accreditations are about setting minimum standards, and best practice requires doing more than the minimum. Level 4 systematic is where risk management is getting more sophisticated. By this point, risk is a factor in every business decision being made. Staff take ownership bottom up in the organisation. And there's a cultural transformation that's taken place where all staff view their decisions and actions through a lens of risk management. Level 5, risk intelligent, is the highest aspiration, and it is difficult to get an entire organisation to this level. I've seen some teams operate at this level, and when you do, you can make amazing decisions which boost profitability and remove the downside risks when things go wrong, as they sometimes do. There's a big difference, though, between being risk intelligent or being risk averse. Risk intelligence is about knowing what risks your organisation is better than anyone else at taking on, rather than avoiding risk altogether. I've been in workshops where this model has been shown, and it is fascinating to see people look at it and calibrate the risk practices against all the different parts of their organisation. We all want to be level 5. That's only human when you put up a model like this, to think that you're doing well and that that's where you want to be. However, more often than not, I've heard people reflect that there are functions or parts of the organisation that operate at different levels. I talked through this in a workshop just the other day, and there was a range of views that saw that different parts of an organisation were anywhere between a level 2 and a level 4. And I think that's quite normal. Even getting your organisation to level 4 is a great achievement. You would be heading towards best practice, certainly doing a lot more than the minimum standards if you're able to get your whole organisation to somewhere like level 4. But I think this model is a terrific way of putting some aspiration and calibration into how and what you do with risk management and how you think about it, and how you can continue to improve on that. Last up on what risk management. It costs less to proactively manage risk today than it will to reactively respond to risk consequences tomorrow. I've seen a bit of chatter coming out through Royal Commissions and in the sector lately about, boards and organisations who make shorter term financial decisions this month, this year, to try and maintain a surplus and underinvest in resources and roles like quality management, risk management, their policies, procedures and systems. And I've seen a chatter start to happen and people viewing that tension in a way that that puts it in such a way that it's talking about you're just creating a bigger risk down the road in 3, 4, 5, 10, whatever years' time, if you're focusing simply on that financial return right now, and if it's at the risk of more appropriately and more responsibly resourcing the quality, risk, policy, process, system elements of your organisation, that will strengthen all of that and reduce the chances or stop the chances of a major incident happening and blowing up in years to come. And it's a bit like the hand in the place of those dominoes there. The dominoes might be falling, but risk management's about putting a hand in the way to stop the rest of the dominoes from also falling down. Impact. The NDIS is about helping participants to achieve their goals, which will be part of their NDIS plan and your service agreement. So services should be built around participant goals, and ultimately providers will be expected to report participant outcomes. Not-for-profit organisations exist to have an impact in people's lives. That's especially true for disability-focused organisations as well. But it can be really hard to measure impact. There are many different measurements that we can look to use in measuring an organisation's success. Too often we fall into looking at financial measurements because they're easier to see and for most directors to understand. However, there are other different measures to look at in ensuring you have a successful organisation. The reason you got involved with the organisation as a director probably had something to do with its social purpose. But then you attend a finance committee meeting and board meeting, and you end up talking about every measurement possible other than the impact the organisation is having on its social and community objectives. How often does that happen? We measure organisations based on a range of key performance indicators, but the best organisations go beyond KPIs and measuring outputs to measure outcomes and impact. Impact is hard to measure, but it's super important. So what is a KPI? Boards tend to look at KPIs or key performance indicators at each of their meetings. KPI is a measurable value that demonstrates how effectively a company is achieving certain business objectives. For example, financial, you might look at revenue margin and ratios. Marketing, you might look at the leads generated and the leads that you've got coming through the sales pipeline or your intake process. Sales, you're looking for new customers. Safety, you might look at your incident rate. Although I would caution that things like an incident rate are a lag indicator. They only show things that have happened in the past. And safety is one of those areas where you really need to focus on what you're doing in a proactive sense, a lead indicator, what you can measure and do now that will help you to get that safety performance, positive safety performance you want in the long run. Quality, having successful internal and external audits, and customer satisfaction or complaints data is part of the KPIs there. In the HR or people and culture area, staff turnover, employee satisfaction, and operationally looking at what repeat business that you're getting. KPIs will give you a good idea of issues and opportunities within the business. So high staff turnover, for example, would be a red flag. High incident rates also could indicate an issue. However, not much of this really gets to the impact of how lives are being transformed in the social purpose of the organisation. These are more internal measures of the health of an organisation and its growth. So looking at the social purpose, there are 3 different things you can measure. You can measure outputs. Those are the things you can count. Numerical counts for programs, actions, or products that were created or delivered. The number of people you served and the activities or services provided. For example, an occupational therapist provides therapy to 100 people. Outputs are measurable and readily determined. It's tempting to just measure outputs because they're easy to produce. You just count them. How many people did you serve? How many programs did you run? but your organisation should try to get to the next level of outcomes and impact. So outcomes. What your product or services or program wish to achieve. Outcomes are meaningful changes for the population served, such as anticipated changes in knowledge, skills, attitude, behaviour, condition, or status. Changes should be measured and monitored and linked directly to the product, service, and program. An outcome is an effect that your product, service, or program produces on the people or issues you serve to address. For example, the result of your occupational therapy services to someone might be that they are now more independent in their activities at home. An outcome is a change that occurred because of your services. It's measurable, time limited, although it may take a while to determine its full effect. Measuring outcomes requires a more significant commitment of time and resources. Plus, you may have to track performance over time. It's also at this point we should consider how the organisation is helping to achieve the goals that an individual has in their NDIS plan. Third one is impact. What effect took place because of your services? Impact consists of the results that are directly due to the outcomes of your services. Results are determined by evaluations that factor out other explanations for those results. Impacts the long-term or indirect effects of your outcomes. Impacts are hard to measure since they may or may not happen, and they're what you hope to accomplish. For example, your OT services may eventually lead to a better quality of life for the individual NDIS participant. But how do you know? What are the indicators of a better quality of life? How long will it take to see that impact? Our last section today is to turn our thinking to governance processes. And as I said at the beginning, this section isn't about going through everything you'd want to know about governance. It's really just trying to target a few key elements that are particularly drawn out as relevant within the NDIS and the NDIS quality standards. So good practice governance includes many different aspects, and it includes having a skills-based board. It includes a process for board induction and training. We've already spoken about some of the sorts of things that board members need to know about, from incident and complaint processes to the types of services and the controls that you have through the organisation. Board members need to be prepared to engage in ongoing learning and be able to set the strategic direction for the organisation, asking the right questions, supporting management effectively, managing risks, and increasingly importantly, protecting the vulnerable people that are accessing their services. I think that's been a real area that's come out in a lot of discussions in the sector in 2020, is looking at how you're governing for vulnerable people. Additional to all of these, a lot of the normal sorts of things apply, whether you're managing, governing an NDIS business, holding effective board meetings, having appropriate agendas and meeting minutes, having an annual board calendar of when you're going to look at certain things throughout the course of the year, not just the dates of the meetings, but some of the topic areas that you'll focus on from one meeting to the next. And also reviewing the Constitution regularly to ensure that's up to date with contemporary governance expectations. The board will need to be clear and regularly review its reporting requirements, including what they need to see from the CEO and senior leadership to acquit the governance responsibilities they have for the organisation. Just a reminder here that the NDIS practice standards also have a section on governance, and we spoke about these in the first governance webinar. The NDIS practice standards specify the quality standards to be met by registered NDIS providers to provide supports and services to NDIS participants. There's both core and supplementary modules that apply to different organisations. And in the core modules, there's a section on governance and operational management. The outcome that the provider or your organisation is required to achieve is that each participant's support is overseen by robust governance and operational management systems relevant or proportionate to the size, scale of the provider and the scope and complexity of supports delivered. Sitting under this outcome are a number of indicators which directors need to understand and follow. I'd suggest that you consider going back to watch or either re-watch the first governance webinar if you want to learn more about this, and even having a read of those governance standards yourself. That brings us almost to the end of our session today, so getting down to what's next. Each of our webinars that we've done in the management series and the governance series is followed by a Q&A session to give you the opportunity to ask questions. We encourage you to submit questions at any point in time prior to that Q&A session, and you can do that through the Facebook group or via email. Please join our NDIS Success Facebook group if you haven't had a chance to do that yet. That group offers a forum to network, share ideas or problems, and offer answers outside the Q&A sessions. And I'd also encourage you to sign up to our CVB LinkedIn page and to follow that as another good way to hear about resources and changes that are coming up in the market as well. Our Q&A session is on this webinar is going to be on the 24th of November. And I'm really looking forward to being joined by Jane Arnott, who's our General Manager, Consulting and Business Services, for that. And she's got tremendous experience within the sector, within the NDIS, and board experience herself that will add to and contribute to that webinar. So thanks for watching our second governance webinar on strategy, risk and impact. Goodbye for now, and we will see you next time.